Session on intellectual property rights, but first I'd like to please join me in thanking Jay for his very good presentation. So I'd ask Luca and Ganesh to come up. Thank you.
Let's keep it short. Just keep it short.
You just go ahead. You're starting now.
Hi, well, we're going to talk a bit about a very important issue, which is intellectual property. And why this is important is really for two reasons. The first is intellectual property has become an issue in North-South free trade agreements, such as the EU-Korea agreement. And Dr. Kim this morning pointed us to what's happening in the EU-Korea agreement and also the comparison or contrast with that of the United States, the Chorus agreement. A second kind of related reason why IPR is going to be important in the future is that South-South agreements will emphasize this gradually. So let's say in the future, a country like Korea, which is a bit more developed than some of the other countries in the South, might have some requirement for IPR in relation to its FTAs with Southern partners. Yeah? For instance, in the case of India or whatever they might be in the future. So FTAs increasingly will look at intellectual property as an important issue. Related to this is that the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, was agreed as part of the Uruguay round and is sitting there as part of the WTO system. So with that in mind, we need to pay some attention to this issue, and these are quite controversial issues. Next slide, please. Oh, can I just take that? So today we're going to really talk about four things, and we're going to try to do it as briefly as we can. We're going to give you some brief introduction of intellectual property, some concepts for you to take away. We're going to talk about the WTO and IP, particularly the TRIPS agreement. We're then going to talk about some examples of IP in FTAs, so that you get a sense of what's coming and what's being thought about. And we're going to finish with some food for thought, some ways of thinking about this important issue. And we're going to try to do this in a fairly stylized way. And we're going to try to give you some examples so we leave some time for the Q&A. Perhaps it's good to start with a definition. So intellectual property really is a bit of an amorphous concept, a little bit hard to understand. In a formal way, it's property right is an intangible asset, a right in the product of the mind. I mean, this is legal language. It's things that come out of human creativity, and it's property in the sense that there's a rent that comes out of it, and because of the person who invents the product or the item, and he charges often a patent or some kind of rent to take from that. So it can exclude people if used in a particular manner. So IPR, in a very simple way, relates to this. And Luca will talk in more detail through examples of what this really means. Now, the stylized facts on IPR are quite complex. The first stylized fact is that there is a lot of controversy about the impact of IPR on developing countries and on industrialization. And we don't have enough empirical evidence on this issue. Is IPR, strong IPR, a good thing for economic development? Is it a bad thing? We don't have strong empirical evidence because it's still evolving as a subject. What we do seem to understand in terms of stylized facts is that the effects of IPR on industry and technology development vary a lot by the country's level of economic development. And that's really because of the way in which technological change happens in a developing country. In the old days, developing countries were thought to be like developed countries at the frontiers of technology, creating new products and processes which then require very strong protection, and somehow that type of activity is synonymous with economic development. What we are learning from the literature of economic development, and particularly of technical change, is that most developing countries are well behind a frontier of technology. And they need to essentially use imported technology efficiently. This notion of learning becomes very important. So they take products and processes that have been developed often in developed countries, and they adapt, imitate, reverse engineer these products. And that is the way they acquire the technical capacity to industrialize. Yeah? And that is very much what we see in the process of economic development, and the Korean experience is very symbiotic of that type of experience. And as countries go up that technological ladder, they become innovators, and they start doing more and more new products and processes. Now, of course, that's a very stylized set of facts, and typically that's what you find in the history of economic development. Now, what that really means, broadly speaking, is that weak IPR, in the broad sense, helps local firms in the early stages to build technological capabilities by permitting imitation, reverse engineering, and activities of that type well behind the frontier. So even poorer developing countries are involved in technological activity, but it's not necessarily R&D at frontiers, creating new products and processes in a very sophisticated manner. And the experience of the newly industrialized economies in East Asia shows this type of learning curve and a ladder of comparative advantage, where over time you go from being an imitator or an adapter of technology to actually creating new products and processes over time, with lots of investments in skills, in institutions, in policies, and so on. Now, as income rises, countries became more involved in innovative effort, and IPR becomes much more important. And that's typically the historical experience. Now, just as a snapshot of this, I just want to show you some very simple data, and I'm not going to spend very much time, but just to set this out as the context for what we are seeing in the trade policy debate. We have here some data on different technological groups. So we have here a high technology group, which really is the OECD countries, as well as the newly industrialized countries such as Korea, Singapore, and so on. We have a moderate technology group as a next group, and we have a negliged group. These are really the least developed countries in the world. And this is, by the way, across the world. It's slightly old, but the same patterns would hold today. So just think of the two extremes, because time is short. These are the OECD countries, essentially, with the newly industrialized countries there, and these are the LDCs, right? Now, what you see are some indicators of technological activity. This is R&D per capita, research and development expenditures per head. This is total R&D. This is patents. So this is one of the IPR indicators. And what you see really is a big dichotomy. The world technological leaders typically have very intense technological activity, and they have considerable innovative capability, as shown also by patenting, and they tend to get much more involved in patenting activity. Right at the other end, the LDCs have no significant technological activity, and they tend to, some argue, gain least from being involved in very strict patent rules, because they can't learn and innovate. And that is a very simple, stylized fact, and maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Let me hand over to Luca now to take you through the rest of the presentation. Luca.
Okay, thank you, Ganesh. Moving on, the political economy of IP. You know, intellectual property in all countries is really about finding this balance between providing access to technology while at the same time, you know, encouraging innovation. And the argument is you encourage innovation by giving people, private individuals, a monopoly of some kind of technology. This can be a patent or a trademark or copyright. So we just put here the two sides of the argument, stimulating innovation, and on the other side, you know, not becoming a too big a barrier to technology and public health. And we will come back to this balance a bit. But really moving on to the technical part of the presentation, we will talk a little bit about TRIPS, the TRIPS agreement, and IP in more technical terms, the different rights, and then ending up with TRIPS Plus, which is really, most of you probably heard about it. This is IP that goes beyond the TRIPS agreement in FTAs, so IP in FTAs. So starting with the TRIPS agreement, we heard about it yesterday, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. A WTO agreement agreed in the Uruguay round. And the key thing here is really the minimum standards of IP protection that's in the TRIPS agreement. For example, it says patents, you must protect patents for 20 years. So you must implement this in your national legislation. And we'll get back to the minimum standards. Also flexibilities, providing exceptions to these substantive rights. Again, patent 20 years, but then you have a mechanism like compulsory license, very relevant to pharmaceuticals. The example is, you have an epidemic in a country, this can be HIV or whatever disease, and the right holder of the technology, so the patent holder, does not produce enough medicine and does not want to give a voluntary license to other companies. So the country can go in, circumvent the patent, and issue a compulsory, a forced license to agencies, other companies, so they can produce generics. So that's a flexibility in the TRIPS that countries are allowed to have as well. And other flexibilities really, longer time frame for implementation of TRIPS. Developed countries had to implement TRIPS in 1996, developing countries in 2000, and LDCs still have time, 2013, and with regard to what is often talked about with TRIPS patent and pharmaceuticals, they have until 2016. And then at the end of the slide, these terms that we know from the other WTO agreement, also from GATT and services and so on, we'll not go into too much detail, but national treatment, right? You have to treat other nationals the same as your own nationals. The MFN principle is interesting because, as we talked about with goods, most favored nation principles means that you have to treat all your trading partners equal. So whatever you do in WTO, you must give the same to others, same tariff liberalization. Then we talked about FTAs here, so that's the exception to MFN. You can discriminate in favor of your FTA partners, give them more favorable tariffs, right? That's the whole concept of FTAs. But in TRIPS, you have the MFN principle, but you don't have the exception. So if you make TRIPS concessions or IP concession in an FTA, they get multilateralized automatically. You have the MFN principle, but you don't have the exception, like Article 24 that you have in GATT. And also, of course, enforcement of IP, and then, being a WTO agreement, the TRIPS agreement is also subject to dispute settlement. So countries can take you to the WTO panel process if they don't feel that you're really following the TRIPS agreement. So really illustrating what we're talking about, the intellectual property rights in a very basic manner. We have the iPhone, right? Trademark, copyrights, patents, and industrial designs. Starting perhaps from the top, the trademark is really the brand name, the company name, Apple. It can be the word Apple or the figure of the apple. You have the iPhone, the big I, the capital I, and the capital P. And that's really the brand name. Copyright is relevant to the iPhone in the context of software. Here is the applications, of course. It can also be the technical manual, the printed book. The industrial design, this is really the non-technical design, so the visual appearance of the phone. That's protected through industrial design rights. And finally, patent, right? The technical, the machinery, the real technology behind the phone. So talking about just briefly each of those 4 rights and the TRIPS minimum standards. So what is it that, pursuant to TRIPS, countries have to implement in their national legislations? So TRIPS mandates that all countries must protect as patent new, useful inventions. So new means first in the world. It must be an unknown technology. Now this means even if you have a technology somewhere that is not patented protected, but it's known, you can't patent it. It's over. It must be new. The second thing is invention. There must be some kind of inventive step, some ingenuity, and it must be ingenuity to a person in that area of technology. So as the standard is here, a person skilled in that art. And finally, industrial applicability can't only be for private use. There must be some kind of commercial aspect to it. So if these 3 conditions are met, all countries must provide patents. And they must provide patents for any invention, in all fields of technology. And this sentence in TRIPS is really where pharmaceuticals came in to patent protection. So as many of you know, many countries before TRIPS did not provide patent protection for pharmaceuticals. But here, bringing in all technologies, countries must provide patent protection for pharmaceuticals. There are still some other exceptions, for example, for plants and so forth, that TRIPS provides. That's a flexibility, as we mentioned before. And 20 years, you must provide patent protection for 20 years, according to TRIPS. So copyright, original literary or artistic works. Here the standard independently created. This means it must be some kind of human thought going into it. The more machinery, the more technical a work is, the less original and the more difficult it is to get copyright. And of course, new to the author, a little bit similar to what we talked about with patents. And what is it? It's books, movies, music, theatrical plays, architectural drawings, and so on. And also software. And this is again a new thing with TRIPS, software coming in under copyright. And before, people really didn't know how to protect software in IP. Some countries used patent to protect it, and some countries used copyright, and some just didn't protect software because it's a new area of technology. But now it's under copyright to harmonize a bit. Of course, you can argue. I just mentioned independently created, right? The way software is protected is the coding. So the coding language is protected as literary works. So just like a book, you take all this coding language, rather complicated, that you sometimes see on the computer, and you protect it the same way as you protect a book. Now, whether this is really independently created, because often, of course, this is computer-created language, you can argue that there's some dispute there. But this is really, this is international politics, and you try and fit software where you can fit it best. And of course, there's a need to protect software today. And the term, really the life of the author or the creator of the work, plus 50 years. Again, you see, copyright is not really created for software. Software with the level of technology today changes a lot, so one could argue whether that's really a relevant standard. But this is the best we got for now. And trademarks, the distinctive signs identifying product or service. We have the examples below, words and signs combined in figures. And here the key really is the distinctiveness. If something is distinct, you can trademark it. Now, the example I always use is with Apple. So if you have an Apple shop or an Apple factory or an Apple plantation, you can't really trademark the word Apple because it's descriptive. If you put the trademark Apple on an apple, it's not really distinct. You can't separate your apple from other apples, and it's descriptive of what you do. Of course, a computer company, if they put Apple on their product, you can it's distinctive from other products. So that's a way of remembering what you can trademark, what you can't. It's always about whether it's descriptive of what you do or not, thereby making it distinct. Also, of course, for the Apple shop, giving him a monopoly of the word Apple is quite damaging to his colleagues trying to sell apples, and suddenly they can't use the word Apple in their marketing. And the term here is 7 years, and that's renewable. So you can keep renewing your trademark protection, and you can have it forever. The only way you can lose a trademark protection is if the word becomes generic. And you can think of Xerox, Kleenex, Walkman, all these words that in the beginning were very strong trademarks. But then after time, partly because of the success of the product, really becoming generic words. Xerox, in some places used as a word just for copying. And Walkman also used as a generic word for that music player. And it's interesting, you can always think ahead what strong trademark can lose. I'm always thinking of Google, because you go around and you say, Google this, Google that. Now, if you mean, if I say to Ganesh, Google it, if I mean, well, go to Google, google.com or Google whatever, then it's okay, because then I refer to the Google site. But when you refer to Google and you start to say it means just go to the internet and do a search on any search engine, then it becomes a generic word. And one day, the today very heavily protected trademark can lose its distinctiveness, really. So design, the final right we'll talk about today, as mentioned, new and original, similar to the other concepts, and the visual appearance, really, of a product. The non-functional, the non-technical. We have a chair there. It's also relevant to textiles patterns, and the term is 10 years. You can protect it. So getting to the FTAs and IP, we call it one of the new issues. IP has been in FTAs for a while, but the reason we call it new issues is because it's really gaining momentum now. Of the Asian FTAs, IP or TRIPS is mentioned in around half. Of course, to a different degree. Many agreements just makes a reference to TRIPS that countries must implement and follow TRIPS, and others goes beyond that. It really depends the level of development of the two parties. Two developing countries often don't have a lot, and developed has some, and two developed countries often can go a bit further. So the main features: cooperation in the implementation of TRIPS, all this technical assistance, a little bit of enforcement. It's not enough, of course, to have the laws. You must also enforce the laws, and then TRIPS Plus. And TRIPS Plus is the IP provision in FTAs that goes beyond the TRIPS minimum standards. So the minimum standards is what we just talked about, right? So 50 years for copyright or 20 years for patents and so forth. And TRIPS Plus is when we go beyond that. And also, perhaps what you have heard about one of the most controversial topics, and also some of the issues that is negotiated at the end of the FTAs, because also parties have some disagreement here. So what does it mean, higher protection? You can raise copyright protection from life plus 50 to life plus 70, for example. Ratification of post-TRIPS IP agreements. This can both be about IP protection, also IP agreements that deals with the registration of IP. You know, you register a trademark in one country, but you need to get it out in other countries, and treaty cooperation can help here. And reducing some of the TRIPS flexibilities. We talked about compulsory license. You know, you can limit, in a FTA, you can say, well, we agree not to use compulsory license only in very limited circumstances. The national emergency have to be very serious and so forth. And the EU, US, really the key drivers of TRIPS Plus. So we'll use some of that, some examples from EU, Korea, US, Korea, just to give you a brief overview of what it is. It's quite technical, but this is just to give you a direction of what TRIPS Plus is and what you can meet in future FTA negotiations. So for example, TRIPS allows countries to revoke a patent if the right holder is not using it, right? Because you give him a monopoly, then he's not using it, so you can revoke it. So the US, Korea really removing that opportunity, abolishing that provision, so reducing a flexibility again. Patentability of plans, the US, Korea says you have to protect plans also with patents. Data exclusivity, I'll just skip. Extension of patent term. Suppose you apply for marketing approval in a country. Well, first you have the patent, of course, 20 years. Then you apply for the marketing approval. You give the test data and so on. Say that takes 5 years. Then you only have 15 years left to kind of earn the money on your investment. Here you can extend your patent term if there's an unreasonable delay in getting the marketing approval. And some of the other rights, trademarks, bit abstract. I hope there won't be any questions on this first line, but really putting in new types of marks. Imagine a trademark is a scent. So merely just the scent of a perfume or something, you protect that as a trademark. Now, why do you do that? You do it because the trademark is remember, we can renew the right, so you get a protection forever, instead of just, for example, a patent protects it with 20 years or whatever. And you know, it's quite difficult to prove, but if you can say that this scent enables you to distinguish two products, then you can trademark protect it. And this is something that they have in both the US and the EU Korea agreements. Copyright, as I mentioned, extending from 50 to 70 years. And then designs, TRIPS have protection for registered designs. You have to register your design, of course. Here, also unregistered designs. So even if you haven't registered your design, your chair, or whatever, if you can prove that this was your design, you can get protection and you can stop somebody else from producing your chair or other piece of furniture. And some of the enforcement measures, really the future of IP, and really what some of the countries are really emphasizing now in FTA negotiations is enforcement. And here are some examples. So criminalizing the trademark counterfeiting and copyright piracy. So these are the people selling the DVDs or making the illegal DVDs with movies. Criminalizing the end user piracy. This is the person sitting at home downloading movies or music. And remember, this is not just civil liability. This is really criminalizing. So you can fine, you can get to jail, and so on. Criminalizing recording of movies in theaters. And then you have some obligations on the border measures to destruct the counterfeit material, cloth with a fake trademark. You have to destruct it. You can't use it for something else. And even the equipment used to produce it, so the computers or DVD machines used to make fake material. Ex officio border action means that even if there's no complaint from a right holder, the border guards in themselves have to search containers or whatever. And finally, one of the new issues, liability of the ISP, the internet service provider. Here, you go in and you kind of give an incentive to the internet service provider to shut down or not provide access to some of these suspicious sites by giving him civil liability. And towards the end here, also a little bit about Japan's bilateral FTAs. These are with the individual ASEAN countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Also quite comprehensive IP chapters here. A lot of it is similar language as to TRIPS, but some TRIPS plus measures, especially with plants relevant to agriculture. You invent a new seed and you want to protect it, and also some of the enforcement that we just mentioned. Then looking ahead, we talked about the US, Korea. They also stated a couple of times that in the TPP negotiation, they're really aiming for similar things as they have in the US, Korea. So that's why it's quite interesting to look at the US, Korea. And the EU, Korea as well, also forming some kind of template for future EU agreements. And you have here some examples. Prohibit pre-grant opposition procedures, the second one there. TRIPS allows countries to have a procedure before a patent is given for right holders to come in, object, and you can have a whole case before you grant the patent. So the TPP, it's on the table now to remove that procedure and only have a procedure afterwards. So you can complain after the patent is given, really to make the patent procedure more smooth instead of having a lot of obstacles on the way to getting the patent. International treaties enforcement. And then not proposed yet, but it's speculated whether they have some of these controversial patent term extension, data exclusivity, which might be proposed. I think they have the next negotiation in 2 weeks. So in concluding, we're going a bit fast because we also want to have some interaction, but some food for thought here. Of course, IP matters in trade negotiations. This is really our point. TRIPS has been and still is a quite controversial agreement with IP, especially for developing countries. In any case, it's there. To some extent, it's becoming a standard. It's referred to in many modern trade agreements, and some agreements also have TRIPS Plus now. Balanced approach to IP protection is really the optimal way. This is the balance that we talked about in the beginning, this balance between encouraging innovation while not limiting access to technology. And this balance is different from different countries. But really gearing your IP legislation to development needs. Some countries patent, you need a more heavily protected or liberalized scheme. Some countries copyright is more relevant, and so on. And that's really what we're saying. You need more research and analysis really in your countries and where to set that balance, how much protection you should give in FTAs, and so forth. And in those circumstances, involvement of private sector, civil society, of course, always an important. And then capacity building, like here in WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and WTO. The readings, some of it will be on the USB. There's also a chapter in the FTA manual that goes a little bit slower than us, a little bit in detail what is really in the FTAs today on IP. WTO, the Understanding WTO also has a good chapter, and then the table Ganesh talked about in the beginning from that Lal paper. And then I think we have a question here for the participants. I think, we invite you, I think we just start a Q&A now, and then we also invite you to comment on some of the questions we have here, the cost and benefits of TRIPS in your country, or of IP in general, or TRIPS Plus, whatever experiences you have. I'm sure you have, different experiences. So we invite you to comment on that, or just have different questions for the presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Luca. So the floor is now open for some questions. I know we're standing between